right, and it's straight up 3 o'clock. So let's get started. This one's going to be short and sweet. We're just covering the modification of terms. So they keep changing the name of this form. It's all right. It used to be called modification of terms, which is where the MT came from in the acronym for it, and then they called it modification of listing agreement and buyer representation agreement or something really long, where if you searched modification of terms, you'd never find it, although the abbreviation was still MT. And now they've broken it apart into 2 modifications. They did this in June, and then they revised it here in July to be released tomorrow. They have the modification of terms listing agreement specifically for between you and the sellers. And then they have a modification of terms buyer representation agreement. So this one gives you the opportunity. You're going to say listing agreement dated between broker and principal. The principal is the seller. The real property, manufactured home or business, you're going to put the address or the legal description there. Listing price, price range, lease, rental amount should be changed too. So this is the price, right? So only if we're changing the price do we fill out that line. If we're not changing the price, just leave it blank. The expiration date has its own separate line as well. So the expiration date is changed to, and then you'd fill in that line there. Again, if you're not changing the expiration date, we just leave it alone. But for the most part, that's usually what we use this form for, those 2 things. We'll talk about it, the other things here in a minute. Note, if the listing agreement is an exclusive agreement for the acquisition of residential property improved with 1 to 4 units, renewal may not last longer than 12 months. So just keep that in mind. It doesn't apply if it's a corporation or an LLC, or if it's not residential 1 to 4 units. So they shouldn't have updated this form because you can see in red, I guess they just marked that it was void. So the update to this form is they're just telling you that if the renewal exceeds 12 months, it's void. Okay, unless it's an LLC partnership. And that you can't record or file the listing agreement or a memorandum or notice thereof with the county recorder's office. There was a company doing this. That's why they've added that in there. The amount of real estate commissions is not fixed by law. They are set by each broker individually and may be negotiable between principal and broker. Real estate commissions include all compensation and fees. So here's the compensation, right? So if we're changing the compensation, again, this is going to be compensation to the listing brokerage only, because per the new rules, once August rolls in and the date magically comes across, we're only compensating the seller is with the listing agreement is only compensating the listing agent. Period. End of story. That's how we need to think about this. They may be offering consideration to the buyers and willing to offer consideration to the buyers, but the compensation itself is just to us as their agents. The other thing about this too is all these changes with the compensation, since we only have 2 short forms and we'll be in and out in like 15 minutes, is that it was always this gray area of fiduciary responsibility. Like, even though I'm not representing the seller's paying me for my services of getting the buyer into contract and closing on the transaction. And so there's always this gray area. There's no more gray area. I guess it was paid by the listing agent. But anyways, now the seller's compensating the buyer and through the buyer compensating us ultimately. So it's negotiated with the buyer. But anyways, compensation here, the amount of compensation. So this would be if you wanted to adjust what was on the listing agreement, we would do it right here on this line. And then there's the other line. This is for all the other things that you may want to change that fall in line with the listing agreement, whether it's the on market date that we talked about earlier with the SELM form and the exclusion, the MLSA, the multiple listing service addendum. We may want to change the on market date. We may want to change the things that stay or go with the property, right? We may, who knows? There's so many things that could be changed on the listing agreement. That's what the other line is for. But you've got specific ones for compensation, expiration, and price. You can do multiple things at the same time, by the way. You can come in there and do a price adjustment. With the price, you can do an extension of the listing period with the expiration date. You could change the compensation and other. You could have all 4 of these all on the same form. There's no limit, and you could just have one. Management approval, if an associate licensee in broker's office enters into this modification of terms on broker's behalf, the broker or manager has the right to cancel this modification of terms in writing within 5 days after its execution. Hence the reason we have rules of why signed documents need to go into SkySlope immediately, generally within 24 hours of signatures is our rule in the office. So get it over to transaction coordinator so they can get it uploaded so that it can be reviewed in case somebody wants to terminate the agreement that you just made, because ultimately your agreement is between the seller and the brokerage. You're just the agent representing the brokerage. Other terms of the listing agreement remain in full effect. Force and effect, except as modified herein. I acknowledge that I've read, understand, and received a copy of this modification of terms. You get to sign this one along with your principals or the sellers. Any questions about the modification of terms listing agreement?
No, so it's not the broker signing, it is me signing.
It is you signing, absolutely.
Okay.
Yep. Perfect. All right, then let's move on to the modification of terms buyer representation agreement. Let's close that window up. That gives us this one. I'm just going to make sure it magically reappears on the Facebook page because sometimes I have problems when I flip between windows. There we go. All right. The modification of terms buyer representation agreement. So again, we've got one now for the listing agreement and a separate one for the buyer rep agreement. They've both been renamed modification of terms. They match the acronym yet again. It's magical. The buyer representation agreement, same idea here as the listing agreement. You're going to put the date of the BRBC, and then you're going to put Realty One Group Fox here as the broker, and the principal are going to be your buyers. Is modified as followed. This is going to be the expiration date. If we need to extend that expiration date. Any renewal of the buyer broker agreement may not last longer than 3 months from the date of this modification unless a buyer is a corporation, LLC, or partnership. If the renewal exceeds 3 months, again, it's going to be void unless buyer is a corporation, LLC, or partnership. The amount of rate of real estate commissions is not fixed by law. They are set by each broker individually and may be negotiable between principal and broker. Real estate commissions include all compensation and fees to broker. So this one, they've got a line here for compensation. Are we changing the amount of the compensation in the BRBC or in the PRSA? I think was the other one. I think I threw away my acronym page. Let's see. It was the PSRA. I was right. No, I put PRSA. PSRA was the one I just covered at 2 o'clock. So we've got expiration date and compensation as our main topics that we're going to change. And then you've got your other line down here as well. There's not a whole lot that goes on the other. This might be if you're changing up the service area, right? Or the, there's really not a whole lot in there. So if it's compensation, it goes on the compensation line. If it's expiration date, it goes on the expiration line. And if it's other. Oh, we had this question come up yesterday. We had a situation where we had a buyer's rep agreement in place that we were going to do a modification on because the seller agreed to pay X% and the buyer was going to pay another portion of it that didn't match what was written on the BRBC. So what the agent was asking about was how to modify the commission to correctly spell out what was happening. There was a cooperating broker compensation being offered, and then the seller or the buyer was going to pay a little bit on top of that. How that would be changed, because in her BRBC, it was just written as a straight percentage, and this was going to be a little less than that percentage, is you would just rewrite it as X% plus X dollar amount. Okay, that's how you would rewrite it. Then I advised her, so that there was no confusion with the buyer or to help alleviate their concerns, you could say C form ABCD and then do the ABCD along with it. The ABCD form is the anticipated broker compensation disclosure, but the compensation from the buyer, we'll go back to that here in a second. The compensation from the buyer is still the percent plus the dollar amount, because we know on the BRBC that if somebody, a third party, is compensating part of that commission, the buyer's portion is reduced by the amount that we're receiving from the third party. So on our BRBC, we need the full amount of the commission that we want to walk away from, because remember, they've changed our BRBC, they've changed the PSRA, so that if the commission that we're receiving from third parties is in excess of what we wrote on our BRBC, we will not get that anymore. It's going to go straight back to the buyer. Okay. So compensation on this, compensation on your BRBC needs to match the total amount of compensation you're going to make from that transaction as a buyer's agent. Super important. Okay. I directed her to say C form ABCD because the anticipated broker compensation disclosure discloses the amount of compensation that you're going to be receiving from other third parties. So that showed that the compensation being offered in the MLS was X%, that the buyer's requirements was Y%, so that they could see what that difference was, so they could see what portion they were responsible for. So that's how you fill that out. Again, management approval if the associate licensing and broker's office enters into this modification of terms on broker's behalf and broker or manager does not approve of its terms, broker or manager may have the right to cancel this modification of terms in writing within 5 days after its execution. All other terms of the buyer representation agreement as applicable remain in full force and effect, except as modified herein. I acknowledge that I've read, understand, and received a copy of this modification of terms buyer representation. So this is how we would modify anything in that BRBC. We're going to use this modification of terms MT-BR. Any questions about the MT-BR?
None.
None. Fabulous. All right, that takes care of our 3 o'clock training. I hope you guys are all enjoying these top of the hour trainings. It's giving my voice a break in between. At 4 o'clock, we're going to cover the BFPI, the BMI, the BIPP, which is the buyer financial and personal information form, which is going to become way more important as we progress down this road. Buyer identification of preferences and priorities, and buyer material issues for a specific property. So we'll cover those at 4 o'clock. I will see you then.
Thank
You're welcome.